South African businesses are increasingly under pressure to comply with foreign anti-corruption laws. Whether they're listed on foreign exchanges or if they're partners with foreign companies, they do need to be aware of anti-corruption legislation. David Rick's here to explain more. He joins us from our Cape Town studio. Morning to you, David. I suppose it's the globalization of anti-corruption, isn't it? Our mindset is still, if you do something in one country, well, maybe you'll get away with it in another, but that's changing.
That is changing. In fact, it changed a couple of years ago. The Americans instituted the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 1977 already, but it's really from about 2008 that they've started hammering on actually policing it and regulating it. The reason that companies need to be aware of it is because there are massive fines at stake for even intermediaries or third parties that do business with overseas companies.
David, when I was reading through this, I found it a rather difficult concept to try and grasp. You're talking about intermediaries that could possibly also be fined. Are you able to give us examples of situations where we have seen companies in South Africa that have not complied with foreign corruption laws and the impact that's had?
I can give you an example. In fact, there are two investigations underway at the moment. One is with Net1, a technology company, and the other with Goldfields South Africa. They are listed on the US stock exchange via American depository receipts, which is a derivative form of flighting their stock on that exchange. Back here in South Africa, they were involved with certain or allegations of certain corrupt activities, and the American Department of Justice is busy investigating them at the moment.
David, who does the prosecuting? I mean, we have issues of territory here, don't we? And who has the authority to initiate a case when there's corruption? Or are we looking at, rather like the United Nations, supranational bodies which will now go about hunting out corruption?
Yes, we are looking at multinational jurisdiction. There are several different legislations out there. There's the American, the British, Australian, Russian, Brazilian. The American and the British legislation, and especially the US, are the people that are really reaching out internationally. If you look at not Transparency International, if you look at the OECD and the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, you'll note that there are about 160 countries worldwide that have signed this. In other words, acknowledging that international anti-corruption is a necessity, but perhaps just paying lip service to it. And now the regulators are reaching out and they are doing the prosecutions. The prosecutions are taking place overseas.
David, how does the legislation in South Africa compare to that in other foreign countries? Are we finding it easier for South African companies to comply?
I think it's the same for companies around the world. Most countries have their own anti-corruption legislation. We have the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act. That doesn't really speak to business specifically. Basically, businesses need to make sure that they have adequate measures in place and substantial bookkeeping and measures and controls in place, and that they actually need, ideally, to have third-party experts like Caveat Legal come in, draft policies, do assessments, due diligences, and set the correct tone at the top, put procedures in place and monitor those procedures.
David, you mentioned Caveat Legal, your company. It sounds like a whole new area of business for legal firms generally, a new area of specialization and perhaps for training at universities.
Training in universities would be a very good angle to go in at. After all, that's where it tends to start. Caveat Legal in particular is able to offer top-class legal advice and direction to clients at a lower cost because we're able to keep overheads low. We don't have the massive infrastructure of the large multinational law firms.
David, thank you so much for making the time to join us and perhaps clarifying that legislation and how it impacts South African companies. That was David Ricks. He's a commercial forensics consultant at Caveat Legal.